where do we go from here? It really looks like the High Court is going to uphold this law. What are the options? The road is running out. Do we see a purchase happening? And do we see Donald Trump enforcing this law with any vigor in the event a transaction doesn't happen?
Well, notably, what we see is there's a deadline of January 19th, which would be the last day of the Biden administration before the Trump administration took office. There is in the law an option of a 90-day extension, so we could see that happen. That would then kick any further conversations around a potential divestment or around other options into the Trump administration. We also could see the Supreme Court act either issue a final decision on the constitutionality of the law or provide some sort of preliminary injunction or even an administrative stay, as was discussed during oral arguments, that could extend that timeline a bit further for what, in any case, even if a divestment were to be found to be possible, would be a quite significant transaction.
And how unprecedented would a stay, a delay by the Supreme Court be? Our own Bloomberg intelligence analysis says, look, basically there's only a 30% chance here of TikTok winning this.
Well, I think some of the question there is, what does the court see in terms of, is there enough of a possibility? Is this considered enough of a risk? Do they need more time to really analyze the underlying constitutional issues of the case such that they want to issue that preliminary injunction on the likelihood that it might happen? Again, there is also that option of the Biden administration doing something to extend that deadline slightly. But I think it remains to be seen whether or not, given that this would be a very quick turnaround, and we've seen that things in this particular issue have moved very quickly, almost unprecedentedly quickly at times, could we see a bit longer of a timeline just to make sure that those deep underlying issues around free speech, around executive power, around what this means about balancing national security versus free speech, some of the questions around the appropriate levels of scrutiny can really be analyzed the way the court wants.
Jennifer, we had Frank McCourt Jr., who, alongside Kevin O'Leary, is presenting this offer to ByteDance as it stands. We had them on the show Friday. His perspective was this is a win for the consumers who keep TikTok in the US. It's a win for potentially investors in the overall parent company ByteDance, because at least they get some value. And more broadly, this is a win for national security. With a different tech stack, with moving to decentralization, would it solve some of these national security concerns from your perspective?
I'm an online speech expert and a technology policy expert, not a national security expert, but I think there are a lot of questions around what a divestment looks like. There's the underlying question of what exactly are you divesting? Is it the branding? Is it the algorithm? Is it the data? So some of these questions about what a satisfactory divestment looks like remains a bit unknown, and that's been one of the underlying issues. The government will have to approve any potential divestment as alleviating the concerns about potential foreign influence. And of course, that remains to be seen what that would look like both in a Biden administration before the 19th, as well as in an incoming Trump administration.
Jennifer, let's pull the lens back a little bit on this whole TikTok story. What are the broader implications of the government singling out the ownership of this app? What happens in other areas? Where could we see some ripple effects?
You know, at the end of the day, this underlying discussion is much bigger than just TikTok itself. A lot of the questions that we saw raised at the Supreme Court were not just about this particular app and this particular data use or this particular relationship to the parent company. They were underlying questions about what does it mean for a divest or ban bill to be potentially a less restrictive means? Is this something that actually implicates speech and forcing a parent company or a U.S. subsidiary to divest from a parent company? Or is that a secondary effect? And that's going to have a much broader impact in the future if we see this come up as it relates to other apps. There also were a lot of questions about what does this mean for the underlying user's speech? So we focused a lot on TikTok and TikTok speech as it relates to their choice of algorithms. But there's also a combined case that involves TikTok users, the millions of Americans who have chosen this to be their preferred platform for content creation. And could the Supreme Court rule on how the government impacts those users' choice of venue?
And it also puts a burden, a specific burden on companies like Apple and Google and even the internet service providers to ensure that this law is upheld. Where does it leave them? And do they have any say in this? The heads of the House China Committee even wrote to those companies ahead of time last month to warn they expect full enforcement. Where does it leave them?
So I think this is a very interesting and often underappreciated element of the law. What the law actually does is it impacts the updating, maintenance, and distribution of this app or of other apps that may find themselves subject to the law. That means that ultimately the enforcement, as you mentioned, comes down to app stores like Google and Apple. It comes down to various ISPs or data storage providers. That does mean there is an option where in some cases TikTok could move the data to continue to allow people to access it potentially, but that would be quite cumbersome, and then that raises its own data security issues for potential users. There are a lot of questions for the users of the app, what this means if on January 20th they wake up and the law has gone into effect. But this does impact the American companies just like it impacts the American users, and I think we have to pay serious attention to what that means as well.
Of course, the principles of the Cato Institute in many ways are libertarian, individual liberty, limited government and the likes. Can you broaden it out to what has been seen to be done elsewhere other than in the United States? TikTok is in Europe, but Europe has far stricter rules around content moderation, for example.
So we've seen, a broader ecosystem around conversations as it relates to tech and online speech more generally. Here in the U.S., when we're looking at this particular issue, we're going to be looking at the potential First Amendment issues here, as well as the broader free speech environment in general. So, of course, one of the concerns is if we start to see the U.S. create divest or ban requirements around this app or around other apps, could we see other countries start to go after some of those leading American platforms, platforms like Facebook or X, around actions that they don't like that those platforms are taking when it comes to their content moderation? And what kind of principles does that give the U.S. and its leadership to push back against potentially some of those attacks if we see the U.S. restricting speech because of how it feels an algorithm is choosing to portray that speech in its own way?